Good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Raven Investigates. Tonight we will be making our way out to Glendive, Montana. There we will dig into a murder at a rest stop, one that occurred only a few hours after the man left his family to go home. This case is one that has been cold for a long time, and has a very small but interesting list of potential suspects. Tonight, we will be investigating the unsolved murder of Dexter William Stefonek. "67-year-old Dexter Stefonek was a retired widower and was enjoying his golden years in the city of Glendive, Montana, after having spent his entire career working in a paper mill in Wisconsin. Unfortunately, in 1984, Dexter's wife of 44 years, Vivian, passed away, and Dexter decided it would be in his best interest to stay with his son and grandchildren, a decision that was probably for the best, but ultimately led to the following situations. As November 18th of 1985 rolled around, and the anniversary of Vivian's death approached, Dexter became homesick and wanted to make the trip back home to Wisconsin. This trip was a 2,000-mile trip, but it was one that he had done many times before. Dexter, being the hard-headed traveler he was, stated that he wanted to make this trip as quickly as he possibly could, so he would stop only at rest stops to sleep there instead of doing any sort of lodging. Nothing about his leaving was unusual, nothing about his decision was abnormal, and nothing about this situation was expected to be anything other than him going back home. Unfortunately, this routine road trip came to an abrupt end almost immediately. At 10 a.m. the next morning, November 19th, Dexter's Plymouth Horizon was found burning in the parking lot of the Bad Route rest stop in Glendive, Montana. The entirety of his car was burning and the inside was engulfed completely. When the fire was finally extinguished, it was determined that Dexter was not in his car. It was completely empty. From here, investigators made an assumption. Dexter had wandered off from his burning car looking for help and was taken by the cold, but no trace of him was found. After further investigation, it was determined that the car had been covered in gasoline and set on fire. They also found that his driver's seat was pushed back, something that made no sense to Dexter's small stature. The seat was pushed back as far as it could go, which meant to investigators that whoever was sitting in the seat was over 6 foot tall. Another assumption was then made by the investigators. Someone took Dexter elsewhere, drove the car back, and set it on fire to destroy evidence. As more information was gathered, the chronology of events started to come into view. At 8 a.m. on November 19th, the custodian of the rest stop, Fred Siegel, showed up at the stop. As he arrived, he noticed that there was a pickup truck parked in the lot, but there was no one actually at the rest stop. At 8:45, so 45 minutes later, Clyde Mitchell, a Montana State Highway supervisor, pulled up to the stop. When he arrived, he noted that there were two vehicles there: Fred, the janitor's pickup, and the aforementioned mysterious Chevy truck. He noted that the second truck had Arizona license plates, and that it was a four-wheel drive Chevy with blue trim and a cow catcher on the front. From there, he left half an hour later to complete his shift, so at 9:15 a.m. At 9:30 a.m., 15 minutes later, as Fred was preparing to leave the stop, Dexter's Plymouth Horizon pulled into the parking lot, but the person driving was not Dexter. The janitor stated that it was a clean-shaven, light-complexioned man that was between 35 and 40. He exited the vehicle carrying two large plastic containers. Fred asked the driver if he needed any help, but the driver simply said, "No thank you, I ran out of gas but was able to get some." Within half an hour of that moment, Dexter's car was found at the rest stop burning and covered in gasoline. Now, this is all interesting, a burning car with a very thin timeline, but there remains one major question. What happened to Dexter? To answer that question, we have to jump 4 months ahead to around March of 1986. A local couple, Bill and Cindy Shaw, went for a walk around a remote landfill approximately 17 miles from the rest stop. While walking around, Cindy spotted a wallet. The two of them remarked that the wallet may have belonged to Dexter. This offhand comment made the both of them feel uneasy, and they pressed on. In their search, they found several articles of men's clothing and belongings, up to and including a men's boot stuck under a mattress. When they lifted the boot out, they found that there was still a foot inside. From here, the situation obviously grew grim. The remains were identified as those of Dexter, his body was examined, and he had a number of injuries on his head, hands, and throat. Despite this, the cause of death was plain to see. There were 2 gunshot wounds in his head. What was strange, in searching around where his body was found, his briefcase was also located, and it contained a large sum of money. Stranger still, the clothing was identified as his, but was determined to have been placed there recently. This was in complete contrast to his body, which was determined to have been there since the day that he went missing. A week after Dexter's body was found, investigators found one clue. A small line of graffiti written in pencil in the men's bathroom at the rest stop. The graffiti read as follows: Hot Jock, shot wad from Wisconsin, 11:85, Saturday the 3rd. Hot Jock was believed to have been a CB handle or nickname for the killer. The final piece of the assumed timeline was the moment that Dexter arrived at the stop. The sheriff assumed that Dexter arrived at around 7 a.m. on the 19th, and the killer was already there. It was theorized that the man may have run out of gas and asked Dexter for help, but Dexter wasn't able to understand or hear him due to being hard of hearing. From here, the killer became furious and pulled a gun, abducting Dexter, and then killing him at the landfill. As a note, there's not a lot of extra information in this case, so this will be a short segment. One of the most important pieces of information is the truck and the type. As stated, it was determined to be a white Chevy 4x4 with a blue horizontal stripe and a white camper shell and Arizona plates. Under hypnosis, Clyde Mitchell was able to recall 3 numbers on the plate: 147. Investigators were able to narrow this down to fewer than 60 drivers, but no further information was gathered based on this. The landfill was remote and was seldom used. In order to get to it, you had to take the main road to a dirt road and then down to the landfill. This led the investigators to believe the murderer was a local to the Glendive area. It was noted by investigators that the trunk of Dexter's car burned the longest and the hottest. And while this may not mean much to you at first mention, it's important as it likely was where the killer had Dexter's body, be it while he was alive or after he was killed. Finally, one person that was interviewed several times during the investigation was Arnold Gratias of Washington. Apparently, Arnold was the last person that Dexter knew to have seen him alive. Dexter and Arnold had invested in some vehicles and were arranging for them to be transported. Now, this may not seem important at face value, but it does get interesting the more you look into it. Apparently, Arnold knew Dexter through his daughter, Amy Hain, who also lived in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Investigators found that Dexter had become very, very close with Amy and her 5 children. She was recently divorced and he was a widower. In fact, it had been noted that he had asked her to marry him, but she said no due to the fact that he was much older than her. He was 67, she was 34. The day before he left his son's house, he had written a letter to her saying how much he missed her and the family. A postcard that would prove to be an interesting piece of final communications. The suspect list isn't very long, but it does have at least one interesting theory that I would like to explore. Let's start with the killer's description. They were described as being a clean-shaven man, assumed to be in their late 30s, and over 6 foot tall. Outside of this, the first person that is technically listed as a suspect is Arnold Gratias. I've read that he was not happy with Dexter's relationship or attempted courtship with his 34-year-old daughter. One point that makes Arnold a possible suspect would be his motive. As stated, he was not happy with the relationship, so it would give him a secondary motive, and the fact that there was a significant amount of money found in Dexter's briefcase indicated that robbery was not the reason for these events to take place, which leaves a gap that an angry father could easily fill. The only problem with this is that Arnold was obviously older than 40. He had a 34-year-old daughter, and he did not fit the description of the person seen driving the car. That's not to say he couldn't just hire someone or had nothing to do with it. The second suspect is one that is a possibility, but it is also a shot in the dark. I actually got this information and idea from a comment on the Unsolved Mysteries official website. Ronald Glenn West was a former police officer that was charged with a number of murders in Blind River, Ontario, Canada. Now, this is an 18-hour drive, but if you look at the map, it's an 18-hour straight highway drive. Around that, let's talk about Ronald's crimes. Ronald was charged and is serving time for robberies, where he killed 2 suburban housewives in Toronto way back in May of 1970, when he was in his 20s. During the first murder, he had shot the victim 5 times in the head and twice in the back. The second victim was shot once in the head and twice in the back after she answered her door. After this, West quit his job as a constable and moved away. Now, he was caught and charged with those robberies where he pled guilty, but there is more. Outside of those charges, Ronald West attacked 2 more people, Gord McAllister and his wife Jackie, and did murder a third person in this situation, at a rest stop in June of 1991. Gord survived, Jackie did not. The 2 of them were sleeping in their motorhome at a picnic area rest stop when they opened the door to a man who said he was a police officer. When they did open the door, Ronald murdered Jackie and shot Gord as he ran away. In June of 1995, Ronald committed a number of robberies, one of which was at a Valentino Furs in Sault Ste. Marie. He pulled a gun, tied the clerk to a coat rack, put on a pair of gloves, and started taking items. The whole situation was described as vicious, and it was noted that the entire robbery took place in the middle of the day, a couple of blocks from a courthouse, and it was as if he had no fear of the police. Now, you may be asking yourself, how does this relate to Dexter? First and foremost, Ronald West was a successful serial killer, and it is unknown how many people he killed or where he killed them. Ronald murdered 2 people in a rest stop and attempted to murder a third. Several of his crimes also involved older people, and he targeted seniors and those that were vulnerable. His crimes were done out in the open, and he had no issue with committing them with people around or in the middle of the day. Moving back to Dexter's case, there was a very good point made by one person in a Reddit comment. The person that murdered him was bold. They left a body in a dump site. They left their own vehicle at the rest stop for others to see for several hours while they went and got the gas. They committed the felony in broad daylight, and they made no attempt to hide themselves when he was seen leaving one car with 2 containers of gasoline by the janitor of the stop. It was also stated that the truck was possibly stolen. That may be why he left it without any concern. If Ronald was involved in Dexter's murder, he may have murdered someone and stolen their truck. To add to this, Ronald matched the description. 6 foot, and he was a former police officer, so he was likely professional or clean-shaven, and at the time of the murder, he would have been 38, exactly within the proposed age range. Now again, it is a shot in the dark with Ronald, but it's an interesting possibility. Disclaimer, this is my opinion, solely my opinion only. It is not your opinion. It is not necessarily a popular opinion or unpopular opinion. It is solely the opinion of As the Raven Dreams. And here we are again at me saying I am genuinely not sure. There was only one person that was considered of interest, and that was Arnold. However, I do have to admit that Ronald's modus operandus is pretty close to how Dexter was murdered. 2 gunshots to the head is overkill. Burning the car was a solid way to get rid of evidence, and his bold nature definitely makes him a suspect. Of course, shot in the dark. If I had to form my opinion, it probably wasn't Ronald, honestly. It was probably somebody who was familiar and lived in the area, but beyond that, I genuinely have no idea, and I hate leaving this open like that, but there's just not much to go on. Sadly, this is another case that likely will never be solved. The janitor that saw the man assumed to be the killer died back in 1997, and Ronald is in prison for the rest of his life, and he's pushing into his mid-70s. Dexter was murdered 35 years ago, and that's a long time to have no leads whatsoever. If it was Ronald, he's not going to talk. If it wasn't, and it was someone else in the city, they've had plenty of time to disappear. That all said, I have to ask you, my dear listeners, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think Dexter was murdered by some random person? Do you think he may have been killed by Arnold due to his relationship with his daughter? Or do you think that it might have been Ronald? Or do you have your own thoughts or opinions on this case? If so, let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear them. But my friends, I hope this video does find you well. And I sincerely hope that you will join me on the next episode of Raven Investigates Still Unsolved Mysteries. But until then, this is Investigator Raven, signing off. Sleep well.